Assalamu alaikum. Today I'll be talking about struggling of Canada's identity. Development in transportation and communication have greatly influenced Canadian history. Large-scale immigration to the west was made possible by railway development. In the early years of the 20th century, the Canadian Pacific Railway was an important transportation link between western and eastern Canada. In the west and in the cities of eastern Canada, new immigrations brought great changes. The cultural mosaic in Canada has changed and the groundwork of today's multiculturalism was developing. At the turn of the century, there were many different ideas about who Canadians were. Some citizens of Canada saw themselves as Canadian within the British Empire. Some of these pro-imperialists believed that there should be imperial free trade, a simple imperial defense policy, and even an imperial union. Others felt simply that Canada enjoyed benefits as a member of a worldwide empire. In December of 1916, Dorman and Prime Minister of the other British dominies were invited to play an important role in the newly formed Imperial War Cabinet. As a member of the War Cabinet, Borden was instrumental in writing and implementing a resolution which stated that dominies, including Canada, would be recognized as an autonomous nation after the war. Memorials at the Canadian War effects can be found both in Canada and abroad. There are 13 memorials throughout France and Belgium honoring Canadians and Newfoundland soldiers. In Canada, Canadian soldiers are honored by the National War Memorial in Ottawa and in the Memorial Chamber of Peace Tower in the Parliament Building. In the 1930s, federal politicians and other Canadian nationalists were concerned by the American dominance of radio broadcasting and its impact on Canadian culture. The official purpose of the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Corporation, which became the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation CBC in 1936, was to promote the national spirit. Conservative Prime Minister Arthur McCann stated that Canada's destiny was nationalhood within the British Empire. Yet McCann also assumed that Canada could influence imperial foreign policy. He advised the convention that the United States oppose a treaty between British and Japan. The Canadian Minister of Fisheries signed a treaty within the United States governing fishing rights between the two countries. This was the first time a Canadian, not a British official, signed an international agreement for Canada. The Balfour Declaration stated that Britain, Canada, and other dominies were self-governing countries having equal rights. The Governor-General was only a representative of the British monarchy. This British statute gave legal stature to the Balfour Report of 1926. It specified that Britain could not pass law binding on the dominies or disallow the dominies' own law. What had been known as an empire were referring to the status as a free association of nations, the British Commonwealth of Nations. Some historians see Vimy Ridge as one of the most important landmarks on the road to Canadian nationalhood. There were those who claimed that the Red at DP served no purpose. Others argued that strategically the Red had served two purposes. It had satisfied the Soviet Union demands by diverting Germans' attention from the Eastern Front. It also provided a chance for Canadian groups to gain valuable experience for an invasion that would come in 1944. The Germans were finally driven back in a battle where French-Canadian unit, the Royal 22nd Regime, distanced itself. When the assault began, the Canadian confronted Alfred Hitler Line, the last German defense front before Rome. The Canadian force succeeded in breaking through the line and continuing north to smash the last line of defense in northern Italy, the Gothic Line, in the fall of 1944. Canadian soldiers weighed in Normandy, France, 6 June 1944. In November 1999, the Canadian Press and Broadcasting News listed the D-Day landing on the beaches of Normandy as the most important Canadian news story of the 20th century. By March of 1945, Canadian soldiers had moved through Belgium and pushed German troops in the Netherlands back across the Random River. Allied victory came in May 1945. It was Canadian command who accepted the surrender of Nazi forces in the Netherlands. Canadian commitment to the war at sea was widespread. At the beginning of the war, the Royal Canadian Navy consisted of 13 ships and about 3,000 sailors. By the end of the war, it expanded to include 370 ships and almost 100,000 personnel. The RCN activity ranged from submarine warfare in the North Atlantic to defend of the West Coast from the fear of Japanese invasion. Finally, the Royal Canadian Air Force was provided with long-range bombers that could cover the convoy until they reached Britain airspace. By 1944-45, the Wolfpack were far less efficient. They were suffering heavily damage from the depth charge dropped by convoy escort ships and bombs dropped by Allied planes. In 1960, the Liberal Party, led by Jean Leclerc, defeated the Union Nationale. The new government promoted a pride in French-Canadian language, literature, and tradition. It also worked to modify Quebec's economy. This attempt became known as the Quiet Revolution. The new attitude in Quebec could be seen in the slogan the government and most Quebecers adopted in 1960, Master in Our Own Home. Under this banner, many French Canadians began to argue that Quebec was not a province like the other, but a nation with its own culture, history, language, and government. The Front de Liberal de Quebec was one of the rational separation movement of the 1960s. The FLQ called for separation of Quebec from the rest of Canada by violent means if necessary. By 1970, the FLQ had committed dozens of robberies to get money, dynamite, and weapons to support its cause. In the Quebec election of 1973, only 6 members of the Parti Québécois were elected. By the 1976 election, however, the party had built wider support. The PQ appealed to those who had turned away from Liberals and also to those who wanted independence. On the night before the election, Levier announced that PQ victory would not lead direct to independence. Rather, he promised to hold a referendum on independence during his first term of office. Canadians and leaders in other countries, including Australia, Netherlands, Belgium, and New Zealand, began to talk about the new status in post-war affairs, the middle power. Canada could play a valuable role as a middle power, smaller than a great power, but wealthier and more powerful than a smaller or poorer nation. In this middle power view that Canadians brought to decisions to create the United Nations. Prime Minister King realized that in the post-war world, there would have to be a strong, efficient international organization. In April 1945, 50 nations led by Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and including Canada, had met in San Francisco and created United Nations, UN. By the 1960s, it was becoming clear that Canada had turned away from American view of society based on the image of melting pot, where immigration gave up their ways and became American. Instead, Canadian society was a mosaic where different cultures made up the whole. On 1st July 1967, Canada celebrated its 100th birthday. There was parties, parades, and celebration in every province and almost every community. Although American influence on Canadian culture remained strong, Canadians began to recognize and celebrate their own cultural figure. In popular music, entertainers from the 1960s, such as Neil Young, were still influential. Also, Anna Murray became a celebrity in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Canadian culture and nationalism were particularly strong in sports, with Canadian athletes capturing national and international headlines in the variety of sports events. Steve Podolczyk and Kathy Kaner were top international downhill skiers. Once they were officially admitted, immigrants and refugees gained land immigrant status, which granted many of the benefits of citizens except the right to vote, to take some government jobs, and have the full protection of Canadian embassies when traveling overseas. For landed immigration, the next step was citizenship. In the 1900s, Canada, at the age of 33, was made up of 7 provinces and 2 territories. There was 5,400,000 people in 1901 when the first international census of the 20th century was taken. Most Canadians were of British, French, Aboriginal, or Northern European ethnic background. 3 of the 5 Canadians lived in rural areas. In 2000, Canada was an important participant in economic organizations such as the World Trade Organization, a strong supporter of the United Nations humanitarian and economic investigation, and a member of the Nord and NATO military alliance. For example, J. Arden Bombardier patented the first snowmobile in 1937 and modernized version of this machine, the Scudo, in 1957. By mid-century, the car had become a standard means of transportation and a social center for teens. In March 1971, a symbol of Canada, for many of our country's immigration were closed. Pier 21 on the Halifax dock had been one of the main entry points for immigration since 1928, reaching its peak in 1940 and 1950. After the Second World War, 48,000 war brides and their 22,000 children entered Canada through Pier 1.